Welcome to Politics for Patriots. Here's your host, the eviscerator of progressive nonsense, the executioner of imbecility, and the grim reaper of BS, Eddie Zipper.
Welcome to episode 68 of the Politics for Patriots podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes if you haven't already. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to the show. Today's show is going to be all about the 2020 election and the gigantic, enormous advantage that belongs to Donald Trump in the 2020 election. Donald Trump is the incumbent president of the United States. And I cannot tell you how much that matters. All right, here's the best way I can explain it. Imagine a presidential debate. The question is about China. You have one candidate sharing their theories about dealing with China, and then the other person talks about all the conversations they've had with Xi Jinping. They talk about the deals that they've actually made with China. It's the hypothetical versus reality. It is theory versus experience. That's what incumbency is all about. Incumbency is the ability to talk about what you have actually accomplished in the job versus the other person's ability, the person challenging you, their ability to criticize you and imagine what they would accomplish if, in a theoretical future, they should hold the job. You are at an astounding disadvantage when you run against an incumbent president. There's a term for it. It's something that the incumbent can do that the challenger cannot. It's called credit claiming, and it is one of the major advantages of incumbency. Okay, it's the person who actually does the job versus the critic. And Americans, whether consciously or unconsciously, Americans have less respect for the critic. Teddy Roosevelt said it best. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
You could use a little TR in your life.
It's not the critic who counts, it's the man in the arena. Another tremendous advantage of incumbency at the national presidential election level is the fact that the incumbent sits back and kicks his feet up while the other party fights among themselves. Republicans already know who the party's 2020 nominee will be. There's no disappointment ahead, because we already know, even if somebody doesn't like Trump, they already know that he's the nominee. The nominee will be Trump. Okay, he's not getting primaried. Somebody primarying Trump is a laughable, never-Trump pipe dream that only the swampiest anti-Trumper would ever entertain. We all know the nominee is going to be Trump. And largely, the Republican Party is pretty united around him. Okay, I don't know what maybe you read in the Bulwark. I'm just kidding, nobody read anything in the Bulwark ever. Half the audience right now is like, what the hell is the Bulwark? Don't worry about it. The Bulwark is essentially the conservative media equivalent of a Frankie Says Relax t-shirt. It's gonna be here today, gone tomorrow. It's basically a slap bracelet for swampy Republicans. But back to the point, I was talking about something. What was I even talking about? Oh, yeah. The Republican Party is united around President Trump. Okay, the Gallup poll shows Trump approval among Republicans consistently in the high 80s. Okay, that's extremely high. That's all you can really hope for. So Trump is not getting primaried. So while the Republican Party is already set, we have a nominee, we're just sitting around waiting. Meanwhile, the Democrats have 243 candidates that are about to tear the Democratic Party to pieces. All right, let's go to the live feed of the Democratic Party searching for a candidate that can beat Donald Trump in 2020.
Found anything yet? Nothing yet, sir. How about you? Not a thing, sir. What about you guys? We ain't found shit.
The Democratic candidates, all 243 of them, are an absolute disaster right now. They are going as far left as they possibly can on every issue. Just whatever the left wants to hear, that's what we are saying. I hate Elizabeth Warren. She's my favorite one. Elizabeth Warren is Instagramming live, so she'll seem hip to the youngsters. She's so wooden. She makes Hillary Clinton seem relatable. Okay? Elizabeth Warren is basically this.
My fellow Americans, as a young boy, I dreamed of being a baseball.
And now she's just biding her time. She's waiting to win that primary and go,
"It was I, you fools. The man you trusted isn't wavy gravy at all."
She's not going to win, though. Oh, believe me, I wish that Elizabeth Warren would win this primary. That would be amazing. I mean, Trump gets her in the news all the time because he wants her to win. I want her to win. I mean, it's so obvious that she's Hillary Clinton all over again, desperately trying way too hard to be whoever the polls tell her it will benefit her to be. And we've seen her tell a lie. I mean, she will not admit that just like Hillary Clinton, she will not admit to any mistake or any lie. I mean, she's digging in, trying to do DNA tests she's a disaster. Oh, she's not going to win, though, because that kind of phonyism is just total political suicide. I mean, we all watched it with Hillary Clinton. Total phony. That's why Obama beat her. That's why Sanders almost beat her. And that's why Trump beat her. The point is, in the end, this primary is going to tear the Democratic Party apart. And they will have the very difficult job of trying to put it back together in just a few months. I mean, if you look back to 2016, just Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders irreparably tore them apart in 2016. Right? 12%. Listen to this. You're not even going to believe these numbers. 12% of Bernie Sanders' primary voters, 12%, voted for Donald Trump in the general election. By the way, these numbers are from a cooperative congressional election study. I came across them in a 538 article. 12% voted for Trump. 4% of Bernie Sanders' primary voters just stayed home. They didn't even go out and vote at all. And about half of them said they would have voted for Clinton if they had voted, and the other half said they wouldn't have voted for Clinton if they'd have gone out to vote. 10% of them voted for a candidate that wasn't Clinton or Trump. So add all that up. Hillary failed to get the vote of 26% of Bernie Sanders' primary voters. That is 1/4. That's over 1/4 of Bernie Sanders' primary voters did not vote for Hillary Clinton. That is a huge percentage, and obviously a huge percentage that she could not afford to lose. It's hard work to heal the party after a divisive primary. Okay, that one had 2 major candidates. How hard do you think it will be if this Democratic primary has 6 or 7 major candidates, tearing the party into 6 or 7 pieces instead of just 2 pieces? And that's how it's starting to shape up. You have Biden, Sanders, Warren, Harris, O'Rourke. They are all shaping up to be major contenders. Now, O'Rourke and Biden aren't even in yet, but I can pretty much guarantee that they will be. All right, so 1 or 2 of these candidates that aren't the ones I just named are going to rise up out of nowhere, and you're going to end up with a lot of major candidates in this primary. How easy does anyone think it'll be to reconstruct the party after that kind of tear apart? And consider this, last time around, when they couldn't get the party put back together enough for Hillary Clinton to win the general election, both parties had divisive primaries and had to put things back together. In 2020, that'll just be the Democrats. And that is a tremendous advantage for the incumbent. In 2015, when about 22 people across both parties were running for president, right? It was the Republican primary was huge. Democratic Party had a few candidates. All right, so you had about 22 people across both parties running for president. Trump had the least relevant political experience of any of them. Or he was at least tied with Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina. Really, the 3 of them were the ones that had no political experience. Now, 4 years later, very different story. Trump now has the most relevant political experience out of all of them, right? You probably have about 22 people running again. Trump has the most relevant political experience. He was an unknown commodity in 2016. Now he's the most defined commodity. Okay? High-ranking Republicans thought it would be career suicide to support Trump in 2016. In 2020, they will understand that it's career suicide to oppose him. In 2016, I supported Trump with nervousness and trepidation. This time it's going to be easy for me because now I've seen. Right? Incumbency in the presidency is the greatest electoral advantage in all of American politics. Let's take a look at that claim through the lens of American history. I just gave it to you through the lens of here are the advantages. Now I'm going to give it to you through the lens of history.
I'm here to help you with your history report.
Okay, how strong is incumbency in the history of the American presidency? Only 8 presidents in American history have lost a bid for re-election. That's about 18%. Of those 8, 3 had total economic disasters hit the country during their term. So far, Trump doesn't have that. So far, Trump has the exact opposite of that.
Bowling averages are way up. Mini golf scores are way down.
Okay, so 3 of them had total economic disasters hit the country, wipe out the economy. So we're just going to take them out of the equation. That leaves you with 5. Of the other 5, 2 would have won re-election, except the fact that a third-party spoiler knocked them out of the race. That leaves John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, who came back 4 years later and won a second term, and Benjamin Harrison, all 19th century presidents. Since the dawn of the 20th century, 19 presidents have run for re-election. 15 of them won, and 4 of them lost. Here are the stories behind the ones that lost. And this is only since the dawn of the 20th century, so I'm not going to get into John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison, all of which are interesting, but that's not for today. That's for different shows, I guess. Once I get into the historical elections, I could just talk for nights and days and days and nights about it. All right, so here are the stories behind the 4 losses. 1912, Taft lost to Woodrow Wilson. This is one of the most interesting elections in American history, and Taft, the Republican, actually had no business losing that election. It was all George Washington's fault that Taft lost. Wow, how can that be? Well, allow me to demystify that comment. George Washington set the precedent that a president of the United States should not serve more than 2 terms. That was one of the best precedents set by any president ever in American history. But if there's anything that I've been talking about the last few weeks, it's the fact that precedents are not a proper deterrent. Precedents are just a soft rule that people follow because they have good manners. And eventually, someone's going to come along and break that precedent. If you want a precedent to be binding, you better make it the law, or you better Article 5 it into the Constitution. Otherwise, some president is going to come along and break it. So anyway, George Washington set the 2-term limit. So McKinley starts his 2nd term in 1901, and McKinley gets shot and killed by this anarchist guy named Leon Czolgosz. And the vice president assumes the presidency. And that vice president was, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt serves most of McKinley's term, and then he runs for re-election in 1908. And he wins, and he serves a 2nd term. As his 2nd term winds down, he decides to honor the George Washington precedent and not run for another term. Even though some of that first, you could make the argument that that was really McKinley's term that he was serving the first time. So he decides to step aside to honor the George Washington precedent. But he's only really willing to do that because he's got a guy to go in and continue to carry out the Theodore Roosevelt agenda. Taft. And so Theodore Roosevelt throws his support behind Taft to be president. And what you have to understand here is that the Republican Party in 1908 is very similar to the Republican Party in 2019. You have Theodore Roosevelt, who's a wildly untraditional Republican. He's a progressive Republican. He's a very populist Republican. Okay, on the other side, you have the establishment Republicans. And they did not like Theodore Roosevelt. They did not ever want Theodore Roosevelt to be president. Right? Theodore Roosevelt was a famous war hero and everybody in the country loved him. And of course, they wanted to capitalize on that, but they didn't want him to actually have any power. So they jammed him into the most inconsequential office that ever existed, the vice presidency. Because that is a fantastic way to cash in on someone without actually giving them any power. Unless Leon Czolgosz shoots the president. And then he becomes president. And then he has lots of power. So you had the Roosevelt Republicans who loved the guy. And you basically, on the other side, had the hashtag NeverTeddies. So when Teddy decided to run in 1908, or he decided not to run in 1908, he picked Taft to be his successor, believing that Taft would continue his progressive agenda. Taft promised that he would. And there was this prevailing feeling across the country that if you voted for Taft, you were voting for another Teddy Roosevelt term. Right? One columnist famously wrote that Taft stood for takes advice from Theodore. There's a famous cartoon where Teddy, dressed in a king's robe, has a little boy version of Taft on his shoulder, and the little boy version of Taft has the crown on. Right? There's another one where Taft is a sheep. It's just a sheep with Taft's big head on it. And Teddy is little Bo Peep shepherding him around. You get the idea. Okay, Taft easily won that election against William Jennings Bryan, 321 electoral votes to 162 electoral votes, because people were giving Teddy Roosevelt a third term. But it turned out Taft did not stand for Takes Advice from Theodore. Taft instead was much more aligned with the establishment, which drove Theodore Roosevelt nuts. And Theodore Roosevelt got so mad he came along and tried to primary Taft leading up to the 1912 election, but Taft ended up getting the nomination. So Theodore Roosevelt started his own party, the Bull Moose Party, and he ran as a third-party candidate. In the 1912 election, it was Taft versus Roosevelt versus Wilson. Also, I'm pretty sure Eugene Debs ran as a socialist, but Debs was pretty inconsequential in that election. Wilson tossed him in jail later. That's off topic. Interesting, though. Alright, so Taft won 8 electoral votes. Roosevelt won 88 electoral votes. He did much better than Taft, even though Taft was the Republican nominee and Roosevelt was this new third party. Roosevelt did much better. And Wilson won 435 electoral votes. But Wilson didn't win a majority of the popular vote. He didn't even come close to a majority of the popular vote. He only won 42% of the popular vote. But because Roosevelt and Taft went halvesies on the Republican vote, Wilson ended up winning in a landslide. In fact, William Jennings Bryan won more popular votes in the 1908 election against Taft, when he got destroyed by Taft, than Wilson actually won in his 1912 landslide. So Taft would have won that election if Theodore had not jumped into it. And I'm not going to lie, I like early Theodore Roosevelt more than I like later Bull Moose Roosevelt. Alright, so the other president, Herbert Hoover, lost re-election in 1932. I don't think that one needs much explanation. When the unemployment rate goes from 3% to 23% during your term, you aren't getting reelected, and that's all there is to it. I don't care if you had nothing to do with it or everything to do with it. You're not going to be president anymore if the unemployment rate goes up 20 percentage points. Okay, the next one is Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, but I'm not counting that one because Gerald Ford wasn't running for re-election. So it's not counted in my statistics. He was never elected. You can't run for re-election if you're not ever elected. He was not elected as president or vice president. Gerald Ford was appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned. Back in the old days, if the vice president position became vacant, like the vice president became president, or the vice president resigned, or the vice president died, then the office just remained vacant. Now we have the 25th Amendment, which says that if the vice president position becomes vacant, then the president can nominate someone, and both houses of Congress, by a simple majority vote, can confirm that person, and then the president can appoint them to be vice president. And that's what happened with Gerald Ford. So like I said, Ford was not running for re-election. He was the incumbent, but he was not ever elected to the office. All right, next up, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had a very bad term as president, but none of it compared to how bad his last couple years were. The energy crisis, which his administration largely created, the Iranian hostage crisis, 13.5% inflation. So Jimmy Carter suffered the same fate as Hoover for basically the same reasons. They're not as pronounced as Hoover's, but it was pretty bad. All right, last one, George H.W. Bush. The election of 1992 looks a little something like the election of 1912. Ross Perot ran a big-time third-party spoiler campaign. He wasn't a Republican, he was a reformist. But that's actually what Teddy Roosevelt was in 1912, too. Remember, he wasn't a Republican either. He was a Progressive Party bull moose, and he moved to the left when he created that bull moose party. Okay, so Ross Perot wasn't a Republican, but he had way more policy overlap with Bush than he did with Clinton. So Ross Perot siphoned off 20 million total votes from the major candidates. That's a ton. That's an enormous number of votes. And the mainstream media likes to pretend that Bush lost because he said the read my lips thing. You hear that all the time. It's one of those echo chamber things where some smart person, like probably John Meacham or something, probably goes on TV and they say, well, Bush lost the election because he said, read my lips, no new taxes, and everybody got mad. That's not what happened. That's not why Bush lost that election. But somebody smart goes on TV and says that that's the reason, and guess what happens? People hear it, everybody starts repeating it, and then it just becomes the smart thing to say. So now anytime anybody talks about the 1992 election, we have to hear the echo chamber talking point that George H.W. Bush lost because he said the no new taxes thing.
Sure, Jan.
That's not why. They know that that's not why. The only reason they like to tell you that that's why is because they don't want to impugn the victory of Bill Clinton. They don't want you to know that the country didn't really want Bill Clinton to be president. But the country really didn't want Bill Clinton to be president, and that is a fact. The truth is, if there were no Ross Perot in 1992, George H.W. Bush would have won re-election. And you can tell just by looking... if you want to use the Doppler effect, just look at the 1994 midterm. Republicans picked up 54 seats in the House and 8 seats in the Senate. That is a wave election. And the reason that happened is because nobody wanted Bill Clinton to be president in the first place. Not nobody, but certainly not anywhere near a majority. Perot siphoned off those 20 million votes, and he siphoned almost all of them from people who would have voted for George H.W. Bush. So that midterm, that Clinton first midterm, there was no avoiding it. It was way bigger than the 2018 midterm, which Democrats have tried to characterize as a wave election, but it was actually not a bad showing historically. Extra impressive given the media's hysterical 24-hour-a-day Trump meltdowns. Extra impressive given the fact that there's a phony Russia investigation weighing Trump down. Extra impressive given the fact that some of the seats Republicans lost in the House were lost because the candidates didn't support Trump enough. Look at Mia Love in Utah. You think she lost that seat because they suddenly turned to Democrat in Utah's 4th? No. She lost that seat because of her never Trumping. That happened in some places. But the point here, it's very hard to beat an incumbent president. Usually, voters give presidents a second term, especially if they've done a good job, which Trump has done. Right? There are no stories in American history anywhere about presidents who presided over fantastic prosperity and then got beat in a re-election campaign. That's a story that actually does not exist in American history. Right? Look at the last few years. Since Trump has been president, more peace, less war, lower unemployment, fantastic economic growth. You think the country's going to say, well, we like economic growth and lower unemployment and more peaceful relationships overseas. But you know what? Let's try something else. That simply does not happen. Or at least it hasn't happened yet. Things happen for the first time all the time, so it could happen for the first time. We don't know what's going to happen between now and then. Maybe something bad will happen to the economy. We know Bill Maher is certainly rooting for that. Probably lots of other Democrats are too. But bottom line here, Trump won in 2016 with no experience in elected office. With the whole media out to destroy him. With people not sure what his policies would be like. With no campaign experience. without donors, without being endorsed by a lot of newspapers who usually endorse the Republican candidate, without being endorsed by a lot of leading Republicans in the House and Senate, without being liked by a lot of the conservative media, with big-time people in the party bashing him. He won after a 17-candidate primary fractured the party along a lot of different political fault lines. All of that is going to be different now. So what's going to happen? Democrats are going to go all over the country campaigning. They're going to be saying, if you elect Trump again,
you'd be creating a space for violence to happen.
But that didn't work last time when nobody knew for sure. It's definitely not going to work this time when everyone knows that that's not true. We know that that's just the mainstream media doing the same thing that Nathan Phillips did. Doing the same thing that Jussie Smollett did. Inventing narratives of hate and violence where they do not actually exist. One last advantage, 2020 Donald Trump is going to be the most fully vetted candidate ever to run for president in the history of the United States. They're not going to dig up any bad new things on him because you know what? Every bad thing he ever thought about doing in his whole life, everyone has done everything they possibly could to uncover it. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe on iTunes. You can listen to old episodes on my website, www.eddiezipperer.com. That's www.eddiezipperer.com. That's it for today. I'm out of here.
The man you trusted isn't wavy gravy at all.
You just listened to Politics for Patriots with Eddie Zipper. Email the show at patriots@eddiezipper.com. And please subscribe.